scheme. And so I'm excited to go through that. I'll just say that I've been working on them for something like 40 years, which is kind of scary to recall. But just before I get into the substance, just wanted to point out a couple things. First of all, we are recording this, so it will be available afterwards. We'll make sure that you have links to that and to some other information that will probably be useful for you. I think when I just looked a little while ago, most people had their name up. Sometimes people have kind of, phone numbers or aliases or whatever, but it's great to have your name so we know who's here. You can ask questions. You can't, we don't have it so everybody can verbalize their questions. So go to the Q&A symbol down at the bottom if you have questions. And we'll try to answer them. Certainly, if there are a lot, we probably can't get through all of them in just an hour, but we'll do our best, and we can try to follow up with some of the others if it makes sense. So I'm going to ask Kylie now to weigh in and tell us a little bit about our great partners here.
Hey everyone, I'm Kylie McClatchy. I'm Wild Virginia's Conservation Support Coordinator. So thank you everyone for being here tonight for our Water Quality Standards webinar. As you may have seen, one lucky person tonight is going to be winning a free kayaking trip with Rivanna River Company. So they're an awesome partner that we have, and they're going to be donating that kayaking trip. So Rivanna River Company gets people outside and connected to nature, and they know that healthy, protected land makes for clean water to play in. So yeah, we just wanted to give a really big thank you to our partners at Rivanna River Company. And so we will be announcing the winner of the kayaking trip at the very end of the webinar. So stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy the webinar, and I'll pass it back over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Kylie. And I guess we can give them the link to Rivanna River Company in our follow-up email too, so they'll know how to find them, even if you don't win the prize. Just wanted to say that this webinar is in the context of Wild Virginia's overall programs. We have something we call our Water and Energy Program, or campaign. You may know, some of you I know by your names are familiar with our work on pipelines, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the ongoing battle with Mountain Valley Pipeline. But we have something called our Campaign for Virginia's Water Future, which is related to the campaign or the pipeline fights, but it's a broader kind of effort that is intended to be, and is going to be, I'm certain, a multi-year project. We actually did announce it in 2020, and we've taken quite a few steps since then to carry it forward. In our original submittal to the State Water Control Board, we had 55 groups overall who joined in pushing for some specific changes to the way Virginia regulates water quality. And water quality standards is one of the main focuses, especially at this first stage. So I just wanted you to know that this is all in the context of that bigger campaign. And then there's another important event, and I'm going to ask Jackie to tell us a little bit about this.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Goodrum. I'm Wild Virginia's Conservation Policy Associate. And so this year is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. It was signed into law on October 18th, 1972, and this year marks 50 years. So the Clean Water Act is a very ambitious and lofty statute. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, we have not fully achieved the goals of that statute to make all of our waters fishable and swimmable and drinkable. So Wild Virginia is trying to just educate and inform and inspire everyone. Given that it's the 50th anniversary, we're providing this online webinar as well as others, one on public comments that we held in March, and another one that will be coming up in September on the Administrative Procedure Act, as well as we have an ongoing blog series on our website, just providing background information about the Clean Water Act in honor and celebration of this significant anniversary. So thanks for joining us tonight to mark the occasion.
Thanks, Jackie. And yeah, just to reemphasize the point is we thought the best way to celebrate this big anniversary is to help people really be advocates for their own waters. And that's why we're going through these trainings, and we want this to be an ongoing effort. It's great to celebrate, and we want to do that, but we want to be practical about it. And you'll see as I go through the other parts of this presentation that, you know, we want to give you the basics, but we really want you to understand how to use them. And that's what's really important. But as Jackie said, the Clean Water Act really is a far-reaching and really kind of visionary law. A bunch of politicians in 1972 came up with what I think is pretty amazing vision to restore and maintain all these features of our waters, the integrity of our waters. You know, they said we got to restore them because we've already messed up an awful lot, and we got to maintain the good quality that we still have. So they were very serious about both parts of that. And we have to be serious about that too when we apply the water quality standards. I like that word integrity that they used because I think it gives you a sense of what's really important about maintaining and improving water quality. Some people will accuse anybody who's working for environmental protection to say, oh, you want to go back to, you know, before we had cars and before we had electric lights and all this stuff. No, we don't think you can go back to prehistoric times, and nobody wants to. What we want is biological, physical, chemical systems that actually work. That doesn't mean you have to take them back to the year zero. It means that you look at what is necessary to make them sustainable and be out for the species and the other processes to work. And you want them so that we as humans can actually use them. We have a variety of uses that we want to and have a right to make of our own waters. And that's part of the integrity of the whole system. So again, standards are really a basic part, and there's some kind of you know, outline here as to what's involved that we need to run through. There are 3 specific parts of water quality standards that have to be there. Now, you should understand that all states have water quality standards. The states themselves are supposed to develop them, and they're supposed to reflect the values and the needs of the people of that state. Now, sometimes states either have not developed standards or they haven't developed all the ones that they're supposed to. And EPA, as the federal oversight agency, has had to step in and develop standards where the states have failed. But in general, it's the state's job, and they're supposed to include these 3 separate parts: designated uses, criteria, and anti-degradation. And I'll talk about each of those. First of all, designated uses are supposed to cover all the waters of the state. So every single water body that is classified as waters of the United States has to have standards. And then all waters of the state that the state of Virginia regulates, even if it goes beyond those federally regulated areas. They have to have at least 1 designated use, and there are several on most of them. EPA says, and we believe that it makes sense, that you presume that aquatic life should be supported in every water body. There are ones where aquatic life is in really bad shape or has been wiped out, but that does not mean it shouldn't be a designated use, because it should be restored. Remember that term from the overall objective. There are provisions where you can come in and a state can say, this use just can never be attainable here, and we'll go through this process to prove that it won't work here. But that's the presumption is supposed to be that aquatic life support and recreation are there. And the state of Virginia designates those uses for every one of the state waters, period. Now, you'll hear this shorthand term, fishable, swimmable. You heard Jackie say fishable, swimmable, drinkable. That's just kind of a broad term to give you the sense of what the overall protection scheme is supposed to do. But fishable doesn't mean that the only aquatic life that you protect are fish that you can go catch. It doesn't matter whether fish are there or not. There are streams where fish can't live because there's not enough habitat or water, but there's still aquatic life there. So that's the important part. And then recreation, it involves whether you can do it safely, whether you can do it without getting hurt or getting diseases or whatever else. But it also involves whether you can or want to do it in a reasonable way. Other designations that are on some waters, but not all of them, of course, public water supplies. In Virginia, normally there's a segment about 5 miles upstream from, say, a water intake for a city or a town that is designated a public water supply segment. And so some special requirements will be enforced there. Shell fishing waters, same thing. Obviously, we don't have many of those up here in the Charlottesville area, but areas where there are particular uses that require some specific kinds of protections might be set out as separate things. Cold or warm water fisheries, sometimes you have that kind of designation. In Virginia, we have a whole series of designations for different types of trout waters, because those are the main cold water fisheries that we aim to protect. You can have other designations. For example, some tribes have waters that where they recognize the traditional ceremonial uses of those waters. We could have other designations here, like, for example, some states have a specific designation of support of the endangered or threatened species that happen to be there, which brings some specific attention to those values. Anyhow, those designated uses, again, they say what we want to do or what we believe should be possible for these water bodies, and then criteria are supposed to describe the kind of conditions that need to be maintained so that you can actually support those designated uses. As I say here, that can be numeric or narrative, and I'm going to get into quite a bit more detail on that later. But again, they should be set so that you know that they will allow you to maintain those uses that you set out. And then finally, there's something called the anti-degradation policy. Again, hark back to that objective where it said restore or maintain. Now we're lucky in Virginia that we still have an awful lot of water bodies that are in pretty great shape. We have plenty of problems to work on, but it's so important to maintain those that where we've held on to that good quality and not let that slide while we concentrate on trying to deal with the problems that we've all created. They set out a system. It's in Virginia regulations and it's in the framework that EPA has come up with under the federal law, where they designate tiers of water, 3 different categories of kinds of water bodies, and different anti-degradation rules apply in each of those. The first one, tier 1, is where you do have some problems. You have a water body that's considered impaired for certain kinds of pollution, certain kinds of problems. And so basically the anti-degradation requirement there is you don't allow it to degrade even further. So essentially you keep it no lower than the baseline water quality criteria that apply. But there's also something called existing uses, and I'm not going to get into the detailed description of what that is, but what it means is that whether you have designated a use or not, the things that are already going on there, you can't wipe them out. You can't create conditions where they're not possible. I'll just give you one quick example. We know there are water bodies where people use them for swimming and fishing and boating, and yet in some cases, states have designated those to say that they're not available for swimming, for example. They'll say they're good enough for boating, but not swimming. But if people are swimming there, that's an existing use. It's been going on, it's still going on, and that should be our goal, to protect that. Now, tier 2 are waters where the quality is above the minimum criteria that are set. And so we shouldn't be lowering that water quality. Congress did recognize that there are some cases where there are values that you need to look at and allow some change in water quality, some lowering, but it's a pretty high standard to allow that to happen. What they said is that if you want to do that, you have to prove that there's a social or economic necessity for doing that, for allowing any kind of slide in water quality. And even then, you can't let it go lower than necessary to meet those necessary purposes. Another part of that is that necessity has to exist in the place, in the area where you want to allow the water to be degraded. Again, it's easy to hark back to the pipeline fights on a lot of these things because it's come into play in so many ways. But if you think about the fact that people have tried to justify impacts from the Mountain Valley Pipeline, for example, on economic development, if you were going to say, let's allow them to lower water quality in the Roanoke River or Sinking Creek or one of the affected streams, and you were going to try to justify it of their social or economic necessity, you would have to show that that's important for that specific area. And yet they want to look at kind of the global, necessity in their view, economic and social. And finally, there's something called tier 3 waters. They're the ones that are supposed to get the very best protection. They're high quality, and they've gone through a process where the state either nominates a water itself, or citizens can nominate waters to be on the tier 2 designation list. In Virginia, they're called exceptional state waters under our law. EPA calls them outstanding national resource waters, but those are really the same thing. And in general, once it gets that designation, there are not supposed to be allowed any new permitted discharges. And so those should be without most impacts once they get that designation. Virginia has something like, I want to say 2 to 3 dozen of these tier 3 waters throughout the state. So there are not many. So back to criteria. As I said before, I'm really going to spend the bulk of the rest of the kind of substantive discussion here on criteria, because again, those are the things that get applied in specific regulatory actions and reviews. And they are a big focus of our campaign that we're pushing forward. So numeric criteria could be something like so many parts per million of copper or mercury or some organic chemical that could be toxic to people, toxic to fish, whatever. And we do have a pretty extensive list of those numeric criteria. Some of those Virginia adopted because EPA put them on a list and said you have to adopt them. The state does have some leeway as to exactly how it sets those numbers. Sometimes it makes sense for those numbers to be very specific for the particular state or even some specific waters. But the bad part about Virginia's numeric criteria is that after many, many years, they've still failed to adopt numeric criteria for some of the most common pollutants and some of the ones that are of most widespread concern and impact. Nutrients and sediment or solids. Most everybody knows of the degradation of the Chesapeake Bay, which of course is the vast majority of Virginia drains into the Chesapeake Bay. And what are the problems there? Nutrients and sediments and solids. That's also the case for a lot of our local waters. Lots of waters in the Shenandoah rivers have had really serious problems with excess algae growth caused by nutrients. Anybody who travels around your locality, who looks at the water when you cross the bridge and sees horribly muddy water, knows that we have a lot of problems with sediments and solids. And yet Virginia has failed to adopt numeric criteria for each of those either of those categories. Now, I list it as turbidity and or solids because there are different ways to measure or to characterize what is caused by some of that, the sediment pollution and that type stuff. But the point is that both of those are very serious. We've been pushing for numeric criteria in both of those areas and are going to continue to do so. But I like to point out that Virginia has had water quality standards in one form or another, not just since 1972 when the Clean Water Act was adopted, but the earliest ones I've found are from about 1954. So we've known we needed to do this. We've known a lot about how to do it, and yet we haven't taken this step, and that's simply unacceptable. So that's one of our big fights. But as I mentioned, narrative water quality criteria are the other type of criteria, and I just say that in most cases we should have both. There are problems that can better be addressed by the numeric criteria, others that can only be addressed through narrative criteria, but you should have both to really reinforce your protections. Now, back in 1972, when the nation basically rose up and said, we've got to do something about our polluted waters, they weren't talking about parts per million of this and parts per billion of that. They were talking about nasty stuff, dead fish and rivers on fire and raw sewage that smelled and was ugly and was foam and all those types of things. So, we didn't get to the dire place where we knew we had to do something serious because somebody was out there measuring specific numbers. We got there because we as Americans, I was around then, as a matter of fact, unlike a lot of you, decided that we just can't use our waters safely and, with some kind of confidence. And so we got to do something about it. And that's just a little example or a little illustration of why narrative criteria can be so important. Way too many words here, but this comes directly from Virginia's regulation. It's Water Quality Standards Regulation, and it talks about how the narrative criteria are set. And, shall be free from all kinds of substances, but you see I've highlighted that interfere directly or indirectly with designated uses. So that's kind of the standard. If I want to use my water body and I can't because it's dangerous, or frankly, I don't want to because it's unpleasant, then that's interfering with my use. Now, obviously, you can also interfere with those aquatic life uses. You can interfere with, drinking water standards and that kind of thing. And then, as I say, more of the regulation, it just talks about some of the specific things that can produce a problem, so that you are interfering with those uses. Color, taste, turbidity, odors. These are all things that we as humans can sense. In fact, in many cases, when you're trying to decide whether we can use a stream and whether it smells bad and that deters our use, or whether it has unnatural color, our senses are as good as anything, as any scientific method or meter to figure those things out. Again, the point is that these are things that should be fairly obvious, and yet we have had a really hard time of getting them addressed. This is just my kind of blunt way of describing how I characterize what we're dealing with here. And the thing is that those actually both numeric and narrative criteria are supposed to be applied in all places where the state has regulatory authority to look at those issues. That includes permitting. There are thousands of discharges across the state from industries, from municipal wastewater plants, from all kinds of even commercial facilities. Sometimes those are individual permits where they look at that specific place in some great detail and set limits based on the particular circumstance. Sometimes there's something called general permits, where it's kind of a one-size-fits-all set of requirements for everything in a certain category. There's something called a construction stormwater general permit that covers, as I say, thousands of development projects across the state. So it is supposed to, within the context of that permit, is supposed to enforce both narrative and numeric water quality criteria, and by the way, anti-degradation, for each of those regulated locations. Water quality certifications, again, that's going to be familiar to a lot of folks who have dealt with the pipelines. I've joked that there are probably more people in Virginia who know what a 401 certification is than in the rest of the country, because we've had such big fights about them in relation to the pipelines. But that is an action that the state can take in regard to a whole slew of federal permits. Anytime there's a federal permit or license that would allow some kind of impacts, some kind that could cause degradation of our state waters, then in general, the state of Virginia has the chance to do what's called a certification. They can say, yes, if you do it the way you've proposed, that'll meet our standards, or they can say, no, we don't think it will, and that vetoes the project. So that's a pretty big deal. There's a process where every 2 years, the state does a statewide water quality assessment. And when they do that, they identify water bodies that have specific problems, and they designate them as impaired. That designation then leads to actions to try to define how to fix the problems and to make sure it happens. And then finally, federal agencies that do separate actions that are not specifically regulated by the state of Virginia, they're still bound to Virginia's water quality standards. For example, when the Forest Service does certain activities, we believe that they have to look at whether they're meeting water quality standards, and we're paying attention to how that is done. So as I say, we've got that problem with numeric criteria where we just don't have some of the ones that are really important. But maybe even more far-reaching and more concerning is that Virginia has simply refused to apply those narrative criteria in quite a few instances where we feel like they have a very clear responsibility to do so. And so that's a big part of our campaign for Virginia's water future, is to look for different ways to push that forward. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And again, I'll go back and note, does it interfere directly or indirectly with uses? On the sediment solids front, again, some people look at muddy streams and they say, well, oh, that's just what happens. But the fact is that those can be pretty serious problems. People say, well, it's just dirt. Well, it's dirt that may keep me from using my water body for recreation. It's dirt that can damage aquatic life and destroy habitats. It's dirt that can hinder withdrawals of water for municipalities or for industrial use. So those are serious problems. We pointed out in the pipeline fights that the state of Virginia had failed to enforce or to implement the narrative criteria in relation to sediments or solids. We have pushed, and the Water Control Board has now said that they have to look at turbidity, which is a way of assessing sediments or solids and how much is there and what kind of effect they have. So throughout those regulatory processes, we have fought over that. Unfortunately, with the Mountain Valley Pipeline just last December, we had one last try to get the state to do its job and enforce those narrative criteria for sediments and solids in regard to the pipeline, and he didn't do it. So we're now in court challenging that decision and challenging their failure. I mentioned too, though, that another place where we're looking at this, and that is that construction stormwater general permit. We have just submitted comments to the state on an upcoming reissuance of that general permit for those thousands of places across the state. And we intend to be involved in that process. That's going to be going on for the next couple of years. Color, that regulation says that one of the specific kinds of things you got to look for is color, wherever it comes from. If you're creating, or if unnatural color conditions are being created in your water body, then you got a problem. This to me is exhibit A of that kind of problem, where we have an industrial discharger that discharges so much of this black color that we can see it in the satellite photos. Now, think about how intense that is if you're boating or swimming around that area, and ask yourself, would that interfere with your use? And remember that recreation includes, is it safe? Is it pleasant? But one of the things is it aesthetically acceptable? We have a right to have water bodies that aren't turned black, or that aren't made smelly, or that don't have slimy stuff on top or settling to the bottom. So we're saying this condition is not legal, it's not acceptable. And we're looking at a specific permit in regard to this. We're also looking for other kinds of places where they're contributing to algae problems and sediment problems. So we're trying to petition the state to change its regulations, but we're also trying to look at particular ways, particular places where they've been implemented through permitting to do something about that. And then I mentioned the water body assessments and the impaired designations. I'm going to ask Jackie to talk a little bit about this and how this works, because she has delved deeply into it. So thanks, Jackie.
Thanks. Sure. So the impaired waters listing process, which happens every 2 years, the state environmental agencies are required under the Clean Water Act to do a water quality assessment and compile their findings into what's called the integrated report. And based on their findings, and for Virginia, we're talking about the Department of Environmental Quality, that is who is responsible with doing this assessment and writing this report and listing these waters based on the information that they find. So the Clean Water Act requires the agencies to review and consider all readily available water quality related information and data. That includes water quality information and problems that members of the public have reported. That also includes data submitted by citizens to the agency in any form, either quantitative as water quality monitoring samples, or qualitative, meaning photographs, written descriptions, or oral testimonies. So obviously, quantitative data is something that is easily measured, and the agency, especially DEQ, prefers that. In fact, their guidance for citizens on submitting data for integrated reporting and impaired waters listing says nothing about qualitative data. It is entirely focused on water quality monitoring data. However, for the past decade, EPA and more recently the court has told DEQ that they need to have some kind of process for evaluating citizen qualitative data, because right now they don't. So why does qualitative data matter? Why do we care about photographs and testimonies and these descriptive indicators of water quality? Well, as Dave mentioned earlier, people are going to decide for themselves whether or not they want to use a water body, whether it's too gross, too slimy, too smelly, whatever. If that impacts their use directly or indirectly, that's a violation of water quality standards. And one of the ways that that is shown by citizens is through qualitative data. A citizen's personal risk tolerances or aesthetic preferences for using a water body might differ from the numeric pollutant values that DEQ or EPA has set for what constitutes an impaired water body. So, but if these photographs, these descriptions, hey, the water body was really smelly today, I didn't want to go kayaking, I didn't want to go boating, I didn't want to go fishing because I thought I could get a nasty rash, or like it made me sick or something, that is impacting the use, and that should be considered in these listing decisions because it is technically violating the plain language of the narrative water quality criteria. So that's why qualitative data is important. That's why it matters. It provides this big picture, holistic view of the actual state of the water body. So we are looking into how can we influence and DEQ in considering this data. They've been ignoring it for decades. They don't have any guidance on it. They, in fact, consider it to be anecdotal, and they've said unkind things about citizen collected data. And they have and their reason for rejecting this types of data is they say it doesn't meet their data quality standards. So one of the things that we are looking into is influencing DEQ, trying to get them to come up with some kind of guidance for how citizens can collect qualitative data in a way that would actually match the standards that they have set for themselves for data quality.
Great, thanks.
And there's precedent for this. Other states have done this. Maryland, Montana, Oregon all look at qualitative data in their impaired listings decisions, and Vermont and California as well, of course, have come up with detailed guidance for how to use qualitative data in listing decisions.
Great, thanks. And I included this picture specifically. That's my buddy, the former Shenandoah Riverkeeper there. And let me just tell you how extreme has been DEQ's resistance. In the case of some of the water bodies in the Shenandoah River or watershed, a number of years ago, I helped. We put together more than 1,000 photographs, aerial photographs on the water, in the water, underneath the water of these kinds of problems. We had probably 120 detailed testimonies from people who use these waters. And yet, as Jackie said, they essentially denigrated them as anecdotal. So there has to be a standard of what's acceptable. Nobody proposes that you take some stray claim that just, out of nowhere and base a regulatory action on that. But at the same time, when there's credible evidence, wherever it comes from and whatever form it's in, it needs to be used. So that was kind of the intensive version of the narrative criteria. Again, I concentrated on that because that's something that we're really working hard right now. And it has such, or it will have such far-reaching effect if we can get those criteria implemented correctly. So that's become one of our really high priorities. I'll just say that as part of the campaign for Virginia's Water Future, I've already noted some of these pieces of it. One thing that we're doing right now, there's something called the triennial review, through which the state looks at their water quality standards, and they are supposed to decide whether any changes or amendments are needed. They're supposed to go to the public and ask what we think, if we have proposed changes that are necessary, which they did. We made detailed proposals and they have rejected them. So we're continuing to advocate for those things. There will be a State Water Control Board meeting on June 22nd where we will be there, and we'll be proposing that they actually bolster the regulations that would kind of force DEQ to actually pay attention to these narrative criteria. So, and then there are processes where the state is supposed to look at numeric criteria for turbidity already ongoing, and we're pushing for the same kind of thing for nutrients. So all of these things are working as part of our campaign. I was supposed to say this at the beginning, but I'll say it even longer here. We need you. We can't do any of this stuff if we don't have support from folks like you. We have folks who volunteer to take part in some of these actions. We have folks who volunteer to help us with just the day-to-day stuff that goes into having an organization. But having you as a member is really, really valuable to us for a couple reasons. First, we can say to decision makers, look at all these people we've got from around the state who care about the same things we do. We're representing not just our voices, but their voices and their concerns. Also, you can bring your perspectives and your ideas to us. We treasure those and we welcome them. So please, there's a link here, but we're definitely going to give you the links in your follow-up email. If you're not a member of Wild Virginia, please join. We really need you. If you have been a member, already a member, make sure you keep up to date. We're currently in the midst of our one of our fundraising kind of campaigns or appeals that goes through what, July 31st, trying to raise a significant amount of money, and we're doing pretty well. But again, we need all the help we can get. We're a small organization, but I think that people who know Wild Virginia know that we produce, that we do a lot. We don't waste resources. And so again, I won't belabor that any longer, but we need you. as I say, we're going to send a follow-up. We're going to give you all kinds of information, and in any form, follow what we do. Look for ways that you can jump in. You know, one of the things we love to do is to tell people when one of these permitting processes or regulatory actions is going on, we'll be writing comments, we'll be producing, you know, our own story for that, but we can help you do it too. Very often people come to me and they say, I don't have anything to say. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how to do that. Well, you do, because you care about these places. If you live around them, you know more about them sometimes than the regulators themselves. So we want you involved any way we can get you. So we're gonna keep working on that. As we come up to the actual 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, stay tuned, because we're going to continue to have some interesting new things happening. In fact, I anticipate that we're going to be announcing kind of a new initiative at the anniversary, and that's just going to be our secret right now as to what that's going to look like. But stay tuned; it's going to be exciting. And now, what we've all been waiting for, drum roll, Kylie is going to tell us who won the trip.
All right, yeah, so we have our lucky winner, the kayaking trip for 2. That's going to be David Peterson. So congratulations, David, and we're going to get in contact with you, so you don't need to do anything at the moment. You'll be hearing from us with some details about the trip. So congratulations again.
Yeah, congratulations. And I see that we have some things in the Q&A box. So I'm going to ask Kylie if she can help sort through those, and we'll do our best to answer some of those.
Yep. Okay, so I'll just go and read through these. So someone asked if there is a detailed map to see which of the 3 degradation tiers apply to any Virginia water bodies, such as streams, rivers, reservoirs.
The answer is not a simple single map. There are 2 things to know. First of all, as I mentioned, there are a very limited number of tier 3 waters, something like 2 to 3 dozen. There's a listing of those in the water quality standards regulation itself. So they're fairly easy to find. Ones that are tier 1 are those that a state has designated as impaired, meaning that they're polluted in a way that they don't meet standards. And there are, unfortunately, lots of those across the state. Now, between those 2, the tier 3 that are designated and the tier 1 that are impaired, everything else is assumed by DEQ to be tier 2 or high quality. So I wish I could give you a more definitive answer. If there's a specific water body you're looking for, that water quality assessment that comes out every 2 years will tell us whether it's impaired. And then that list of tier 3 waters, if it's not on there, if it's not on either one of those, it's tier 2. Now, if you have a specific water body that you're interested in, send me an email. I can help you. Okay.
Awesome. Then the next question is, what are the conditions that would lead to or allow and enable designating a body of water as tier 3?
Good question. They can, the nomination for tier 3, first of all, you have to, it has to be not impaired. So there can't be evidence, sampling data, whatever that shows an impairment, because that kicks it out of the category. But beyond that, basically, it has to have values, high values for aquatic life support, for recreation, for aesthetics, any of those things. And the ones that I know that have been designated usually have some of all those, because a really good water body is both inviting to people who want to use it, and is also good habitat. So if you look at some of the nomination documents, they're not all that elaborate, but they'll just describe, you know, we have these fish species here, we have these kinds of mussels, we have this natural feature, and people use this area for swimming and boating and so on. So it's nothing incredible, but it's kind of that cumulative collection of values, things that make it special. I'm not sure that's a very good answer. That's the best I can do right now.
Okay, so we have a couple others. Someone asked about when we talk about the state not doing their due diligence with regard to enforcing narrative criteria, who we're specifically talking about. So which agencies? Is it DEQ or others?
Well, the DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, has the duty to apply these in regulatory activities. Now, the State Water Control Board, which is the citizen body that kind of oversees the regulatory aspects of our water, they also have responsibilities. It's kind of divided up. At this point, if a permit is going to be issued, that's solely DEQ's responsibility and duty. But if there are problems with the way that's working, one of the best ways to fix that is to amend a regulation or to adopt a new regulation. And that is the State Water Control Board's responsibility. So each of those bodies has a duty, and we're pushing both of them to play their role correctly.
So we have another question asking about if Virginia does not have any numerics or quantitative standards for clean water, what criteria is the Virginia Department of Health using when they create the charts that show the max number of fish that are safe to eat? So the signs that are posted at the boat ramps across the state.
Okay, well, it appears I wasn't clear enough, which is very often the case. We don't have all the numeric criteria we should, but we do have a pretty big list of numeric criteria. They include things for toxics, metals, and organics. They include a whole slew of things, both in fish tissue, in the water, to say what's safe. And so those are the kinds of things. There are also public health guidelines that the Department of Health can use for those types of things. So we do have numeric criteria, and we have other benchmarks that are important for health effects. So I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, but we do have a lot of those. And those I will say that where we have those numeric criteria and where they have been implemented, enforced for a lot of our discharges, like wastewater plants and industries, they've been effective. We have cleaned up a lot of water through those things. That's why it's so important to come along and fill the gaps that are still there after these many years.
All right, and someone else asked if we're in the process of getting baseline numeric water quality data on water bodies around the state.
We have done some of that. There are lots of groups that do water monitoring. One of the things that we have done or contributed to is specifically in regard to areas that would be affected by the pipelines. Again, originally the ACP and now the MVP. So there are dozens of folks who have been out monitoring water quality both before and since some of that work has happened. So that's part of kind of the baseline. But I'll say the state has its own pretty extensive monitoring network. So there's a lot of data out there in different forms. One of the things Wild Virginia is doing right now is we've got an expert who is compiling, who's looking through the different forms of data on turbidity and solids, so that we can kind of bring together all those different sources, because there are a lot of them. But we want to have a better picture of all of it and what it really tells us.
Okay, awesome. And someone else asked, in your discussion for the slide titled Impaired Water Body Listings / TDMLs, you said that the state must prepare reports on the public comments that they have received about the impaired water bodies. They asked, what type of communications is DEQ considering? And does this include our comments on the MVP?
You want to try that one, Jackie?
Sure. So for the integrated reports, the DEQ considers water quality monitoring data, meaning that they go out a couple times a year and they measure the amount of pollutants in the water body. That is the data that they primarily consider for this. They will also consider citizen submitted water quality monitoring data that has been, that meets their quality assurance protocols. They are supposed to legally be also at least looking at, not necessarily making their decision based on, but looking at public comments that people have made about water bodies that are that they think might be impaired. They're supposed to be at least looking at, considering photographs, oral testimonies, any kind of written descriptions. But the Virginia Water Assessment Manual is just about water quality monitoring data. When the DEQ was, when EPA was sued for a decision it made a couple years ago about a DEQ non-impairment finding on the Shenandoah River, the information that DEQ said it relied on to make its decision was water quality monitoring data, not the 120 photographs that Dave was talking about or the expert testimony that Dave and other experts gave. They do not, at this point in time, use that data, meaning they don't rely on it in their decision making, and they have not been even considering looking at it. They don't have a process for how to do that. They've been told by EPA multiple times since 2012 that they need to have one. As there's been a bigger and bigger push for citizen scientists to use citizen science data since the Obama administration, continuing into the Trump administration and continuing into the Biden administration, these types of issues have been coming up more. State environmental agencies are receiving more citizen data than they ever had before because everyone has a smartphone, or a lot of people have smartphones. It's very easy to collect data. It's very easy to just be out and take a photograph and email it to DEQ and say like, hey, this looks really gross. I don't want to swim in it. I hope that answered your question. I saw there was some other question about data quality, and I wanted to, I'm gonna put in the chat a link to a handbook that EPA produced first in 2019 and they recently updated in 2022 that talks about quality assurance protocols for citizen submitted data. And it talks about how to do the kind of data you want to collect, how to collect it, what kind of protocols you might put into place in the hopes that the environmental agency would actually use that data in their decision making. So one of the specific steps that can be taken is educating citizens about the quality standards that are required for their data to be used, or at least trying to get this sort of EPA standard, and then letting, if there's no standard like there is right now in Virginia for qualitative data, it's like, well, looking through and learning about, well, what does EPA say is good enough for this kind of quality of data. Another thing you can do is actually just having these conversations, because these sorts of issues are relatively novel. And it's something that environmental agencies don't always do the work that they're supposed to be doing because it takes a lot of time and energy and effort. And so having conversations, collecting the best possible data you can, making sure it meets high quality standards and learning how to do that are all steps that can be taken to try to get DEQ to pay attention to qualitative data.
And I am seeing that there's a ton more of questions and issues that people have raised that I don't think we're going to get through here. We can, I know we can save the stuff in the chat. Can we can save what's in the Q&A. You guys, do you know how to do that? Because I don't know how to do that. What I'm getting at is I think that I can sort through those and we can try to help. We won't be able to do it immediately, but if we can spend some time on those, we could probably send any follow-up to try to address some of those others, because there's some good questions there and I don't want to leave you totally hanging. So are we able to save all those? Kylie, Jackie?
I'm not sure if it saves directly, but I've captured screenshots of the questions, so I have them regardless.
Okay, good. Because I'm inept at doing these things, so I had to rely on somebody else. Okay, well, we're up to 8:02. That was a lot packed in, but I can see from all the questions that you have thought a lot about these issues, and I appreciate that. I hope this was useful to you. There's so much that can be said about this that it's kind of hard to figure out what level. There's probably folks here who know quite a bit about standards and some who don't know anything. So it's kind of hard to set the right level of detail. But I hope it was useful to you. Really thankful that you showed up. And again, stick with us. Pay attention to what we're doing on some of these particular actions, because we intend to continue to try to make sure that these things get fixed. We're not stopping anytime soon, and we're going to try to make sure that the improvements happen. So with that, I'll say good night, and thanks so much for being here.